I had always thought camping would be a perfect escape, the kind of thing that clears your mind, lets you breathe in fresh air, and forget about everything. So when Lucy suggested we go camping for the weekend, it seemed like a good idea. No distractions, no phones, just the two of us and the quiet of nature. It was supposed to be the kind of trip where we could talk, relax, and enjoy the simple things. The campsite we picked was remote, far from any major roads or towns, deep in the woods. It felt like a great place to unwind. Little did we know, it would be the last peaceful weekend we would ever have. The first few hours of setting up were perfect. The weather was clear, the air was crisp, and the forest was full of life. We laughed as we set up the tent, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories from our childhoods. It felt like we were two kids again, so far removed from the world. I had no idea that as the night drew closer, the atmosphere around us would shift so drastically. The air would grow heavy, and the silence would slowly become suffocating. As the sun dipped below the horizon, something changed. It was like the forest was slowly waking up, but not in a peaceful way. I first noticed it when we sat down by the fire. The crackling of the flames seemed to fade into the background, and all I could hear was the whispering of the wind through the trees. But even the wind felt off, like it wasn't the usual breeze that passed through. It was different, thick, almost unnatural. Then came the sound of twigs snapping, soft but deliberate, coming from the direction of the tree line. "Did you hear that?" Lucy asked, her voice already tinged with unease. I looked at her and nodded, though I tried to brush it off. It was probably just an animal, I told myself, the wind or something. But the feeling of being watched started creeping in, and I couldn't ignore it. It was as if every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, was a sign that something was lurking just beyond the firelight. "Probably just some squirrels or something," I said, trying to reassure myself as much as her. But even I could tell I wasn't convinced. We spent the next hour talking, but the noises around us never stopped. It was like the woods were alive, whispering, shifting, and moving. Every few minutes, I would glance around the trees, half expecting to see someone or something watching us. Lucy was getting nervous now too. Her voice was quieter, her movements more hesitant, as if she could sense it too. The fear was starting to settle in. We finally decided to go to bed. We zipped ourselves into the tent, hoping the warmth would soothe us. But the strange feeling didn't go away. I lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside the tent. The whispering wind was still there, but now I could hear something else. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking around the perimeter of our campsite. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I stayed silent, hoping it was just an animal again. But then I heard it, more distinct now, closer to the tent, the unmistakable sound of footsteps right outside. "Lucy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" She nodded wide-eyed, her breath shallow. We both froze, too afraid to speak. The footsteps continued. Whoever, or whatever it was walking in circles around our tent, deliberately making noise. My mind raced. Was it someone else camping nearby? But why would they be so close? Why wasn't anyone else saying anything? I didn't want to get out of the tent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight, whispered to Lucy to stay inside, and unzipped the tent. The moment the cold night air hit me, I felt it, an intense, oppressive stillness. I stepped out into the dark, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the blackness. The woods were eerily silent now. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. I shone the light around, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I saw nothing. No one was around. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. And then I saw it, a shadow, a tall dark shape standing just beyond the edge of the trees. barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't a person, it was something else. It seemed to pulse with the darkness around it. I couldn't make out any features, just an outline, but it felt like it was staring at me. I took a step closer, but the moment I did, it vanished. Gone, like smoke, like it had never been there at all. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. My mind couldn't process what I'd just seen. It didn't make sense. Shadows didn't just vanish. But when I turned around and ran back to the tent, I could feel my heart racing in my chest. The terror was real. I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I had seen. I knew something was out there, something that wasn't human. Lucy was awake when I got back, her eyes wide with fear. I told her what I'd seen, but she wasn't convinced. She wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, that I had been imagining things. But I knew better now. The woods had become something else, something dark, and we weren't alone. That night, we both lay awake in the tent, listening to the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't just around us. They were closer, louder. I could feel the presence outside, just beyond the fabric of the tent. I could feel the breath of whatever was watching us. But when I tried to look, to confront whatever it was, there was nothing. The shadows danced around the trees, but nothing emerged. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we were both exhausted, terrified, and utterly shaken. We packed up as quickly as we could, not saying much to each other. The woods felt different now, like the air was heavier, thicker. We made our way back to the car, but when I looked back at the campsite one last time, I saw it. The shadow. It was standing there, just at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as I turned away, not daring to look again. The shadow stayed there, still, unmoving, as we drove away from that cursed place. I don't know what it was. I don't know what happened that weekend. But I know one thing for sure. That shadow was real, and I don't ever want to go back to those woods again. The thought of what might still be out there, waiting, haunts me. We were 3 friends on a camping trip, far away from the noise of the city, nestled beside a quiet lake, surrounded by thick woods. The perfect place for a weekend retreat. Ethan, Max, and I have been planning the trip for months, hoping to escape the stress of our lives and just enjoy nature. After a long day of hiking and setting up camp, we finally settled around the campfire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across our faces. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the night was perfectly still, too still. We sat there, roasting marshmallows and chatting, when Sarah, with her usual mischievous grin, suggested telling a scary story. The idea seemed perfect. After all, what's a camping trip without a little spooky tale to get the blood pumping? I didn't think it would go any further than that, just a casual exchange of chills before bed. But when Sarah started speaking, I felt an eerie tension in the air, like the woods themselves were listening. "There's a story about this place," she began, her voice lowering into a soft, ominous tone. "About a family that went missing not far from here. A long time ago, of course, but people still talk about it. They say that one night, a father started hearing voices in the woods, whispers that told him he was being watched. He became obsessed with these voices. He'd claim that someone was out there, hiding in the trees, watching him and his family. He became paranoid, and eventually he went crazy. His family was terrified, but they had no choice but to stay with him." I looked at Max and Ethan, both of them listening intently now. Sarah had a way of making even the simplest stories seem more real, more unsettling. But she didn't stop there. "They were never found," Sarah continued. "The authorities searched, but there was no sign of the family. No bodies, no evidence of anything. It's like they just vanished. Some people say they were taken by the figure the father had seen, the one he said was stalking them. Others say the family was just caught in a tragic accident. But people who live nearby swear they still hear strange noises from the woods, like whispers on the wind. Some say it's the father, still out there calling for help, but no one has ever seen him again. Max snorted, clearly unconvinced. Come on, Sarah. That's just some old campfire legend. Everyone's heard that one before. He tossed a marshmallow into the fire, trying to brush off the creeping feeling in the air. But Sarah wasn't finished. She leaned in closer, her voice almost a whisper now. Well, maybe you're right. But something happened to me last year, something I couldn't explain. I was camping at this very site, and late one night, I thought I heard voices, whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard my name, and then someone else's. I heard it so clearly that I could almost feel someone standing behind me. I looked around, but there was no one there. And then the smell of smoke, like something burning, lingered in the air. It wasn't until I saw the fog rolling in that I realized what was happening. I stared at her, unnerved. There was something in her eyes now, a strange intensity. Max was laughing, though it was forced, and even Ethan looked uncomfortable. Okay, enough with the scary stories, Max said, trying to change the subject. Let's just get some sleep. We've got a long day tomorrow. But his voice sounded off, tired, anxious. We crawled into our tents, hoping the cold night air and the rhythmic sounds of the woods would help us fall asleep. But Sarah's words seemed to cling to the air around us. Whispers, footsteps, the smell of smoke. My mind kept drifting back to them. The night was quiet for a while, and then, just as we were beginning to relax, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a soft crunch of twigs breaking in the distance. I told myself it was probably an animal. But then, the sound grew louder. I could hear something moving in the woods, and it wasn't an animal. No, this was something heavier, deliberate, like footsteps. My heart began to race. I poked my head out of the tent and looked around. I saw nothing. The woods were dark and still, save for the wind rustling the trees. But I wasn't imagining it. I heard it again, a slow, deliberate step, followed by another and another. Something, or someone, was out there. Ethan, Max, I whispered. Do you hear that? They didn't respond right away, but I could see the fear in their eyes when they finally did. Yeah, Max said quietly. What the hell is that? We listened, our breathing shallow, and then through the trees came a sound I couldn't deny. A voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the breeze, but then it grew clearer. A word. My name. Sarah, Sarah. I froze. The voice was soft but unmistakable. It wasn't any of us. None of us had spoken. And then suddenly there was another voice, just as quiet. Ethan's name. Ethan. Ethan. I felt a chill run down my spine, and we all sat in complete silence, trying to make sense of it. Max grabbed his flashlight and flicked it on, shining the beam into the woods. The light bounced off the trees, but there was no one there. Only shadows. What the hell? Evan whispered, his voice trembling. We didn't know what to do. It had to be our minds playing tricks, right? But the whispering voices, the sounds of something heavy moving in the woods, were too real to ignore. And then, just as we were about to convince ourselves it was nothing, a figure appeared. It was standing just at the edge of our campsite, obscured by the darkness. A figure in a dark hood, barely visible, but tall and unmistakably human. My heart pounded in my chest. It didn't move at first, but then it started toward us, slowly, deliberately. The figure stepped forward, each footfall echoing in the stillness of the night. I felt a wave of panic rise up in me. We have to leave, I said, voice shaking. But as we turned to grab our things, we were met with something even worse. A thick, impenetrable fog had rolled in from nowhere, surrounding us in seconds, completely obscuring the campsite. We couldn't see anything beyond a few feet in front of us, but we could feel it. The figure had moved closer, its presence now overwhelming. We could hear the steady sound of its footsteps in the fog, getting closer and closer, until we were sure it was right behind us. In blind panic, we rushed toward the road, desperate to escape. But no matter how far we ran, it felt like the fog was closing in on us, trapping us in the woods. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke free. The fog lifted, and the moonlight broke through, revealing the familiar outline of our campsite. But it wasn't the same. Everything looked darker, colder, and more sinister. We weren't in the same place anymore. The woods felt alive, like something had changed, something had shifted. The figure was gone, but we all knew it hadn't been a figment of our imaginations. We packed up as quickly as possible and left, never speaking of what had happened again. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been part of something much darker than a simple campfire story. Whatever we had encountered that night, it wasn't a legend. It was real, and I knew deep down that it was still out there waiting. Julia had always been an experienced hiker. She found solace in the solitude of nature, the quiet rhythm of her boots crunching against the trail, the sound of the wind whispering through the trees, and the peace that only the wilderness could provide. This time, she had chosen a secluded mountain trail, far from the familiar paths that crisscrossed the national parks. The area was known for its breathtaking views, distant mountain ranges that stretched for miles, quiet lakes tucked in valleys, and forests so dense it felt like walking through an untouched world. The hike had been long, but she had made it to her campsite by late afternoon, her backpack heavy but manageable. She set up a tent near the edge of a small clearing, the late-day sunlight casting long shadows across the landscape. With everything in place, she took a moment to sit on a rock and enjoy the view. The mountain air was crisp, the sky a perfect shade of blue, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of the trees. Julia felt a deep sense of peace, a rare feeling she rarely experienced back in the chaotic hustle of daily life. But that peace was soon interrupted. As she looked out across the clearing, Julia noticed something odd in the distance. A man. He was standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the fading light, but he was there. He was dressed in a long black coat, the fabric billowing slightly in the breeze. His figure was strange, out of place against the natural backdrop of trees and rugged terrain. Julia squinted, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. People didn't typically hike through this area. It was too remote, too difficult to reach. And yet, there he was, standing still as if he had been there the whole time. She could see his face from a distance, pale, emotionless. And when she looked directly at him, he suddenly turned and stared right back at her. Her heart skipped a beat. It was as if he had been waiting for her to notice. His gaze was unblinking, unsettling. Julia quickly looked away, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling settling over her. She told herself that it was nothing. The man was just another hiker, maybe lost, maybe just taking in the view. She tried to focus on the mountain scenery again, but the image of him, standing there, eyes locked on hers, wouldn't leave her mind. That night, after dinner, as the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle above, Julia retired to her tent. She tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that she was just being paranoid. But the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. The wind howled through the trees, but something about the stillness felt off. Then she heard it. Footsteps. At first, they were faint, just the softest crunch of leaves underfoot. But as she lay there, her heart thumping in her chest, they grew louder. The sound of someone walking, slowly, carefully near her tent. It was unmistakable. Julia's breath caught in her throat. She waited, frozen in place. The footsteps stopped for a moment, And then there was the faint rustle of the tent flap. She could hear the soft scrape of a boot against the ground just outside. Her mind raced. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be the man in the black coat. But when she slowly unzipped the tent and peered out, there was no one there, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. She spent the rest of the night wide awake, her eyes darting to every sound, every movement. But the footsteps didn't return. Still, the eerie feeling lingered. The next morning, Julia tried to convince herself that it was just the wind, that the crackling sounds of the forest had played tricks on her ears. She spent the day exploring the trail, trying to put the strange encounter out of her mind. But as she made her way back to camp, she saw him again. The man in the black coat, standing just outside the edge of her campsite, watching her. He never moved, never spoke, just stood there, his cold, lifeless eyes fixed on her. Julia's stomach churned. She couldn't explain why he was there or what he wanted, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. She tried to ignore it, but each time she glanced at him, he seemed closer. And every night, as darkness crept in, she heard the footsteps again. They never came too close, but they circled her tent, as if the man was pacing, watching, waiting. As the days passed, Julia became more and more anxious. She had hiked these mountains countless times before, but this felt different. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong. She couldn't keep ignoring it. The man in the black coat wasn't a figment of her imagination. He was real, and he was stalking her. One evening, after another day spent trying to push through the unease, Julia saw him again. This time, he was sitting by a distant tree, his back to her. The position of his body, the way he sat perfectly still, it was unnatural. Julia felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't make herself leave. She had nowhere to go. But then, the man stood up, slowly, deliberately, as if moving only when he knew she was watching. She couldn't breathe. Something inside her snapped. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. This wasn't just an odd coincidence. The man was here for a reason. In a burst of fear and adrenaline, Julia grabbed her gear, shoved it into her pack, and began to run. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know which way the trail was. But she ran, heart pounding in her chest, branches slapping at her face, her feet stumbling over rocks and uneven ground. Behind her, she heard it, the steady sound of footsteps echoing through the woods. Closer, closer still. The man was following her, his presence inescapable. Julia's breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't dare look behind her. She didn't want to know how close he was. But she could feel it, every step, every breath. It was as if he were right on her heels, just waiting for the right moment to catch her. After what felt like an eternity of running blindly through the dark, she stumbled upon something, a small ranger station, barely visible in the distance. She ran to it, heart thundering in her chest, and burst through the door. The ranger inside looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" I need help," Julia gasped. "There's a man in a black coat. He's following me. Please, you have to help me." The ranger stared at her, confused. "Ma'am, no one else has been reported on this trail recently. No one but you." Julia's mind went blank. She didn't understand. She couldn't explain it. The man had been there. She had seen him. She had heard his footsteps. But the ranger's words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. "There's no one else out there, ma'am. You must have been seeing things. You're just shaken up from hiking alone." Julia couldn't make sense of it. She knew what she had seen. She knew what had happened. But no one believed her. She never returned to that trail. To this day, the memory of the man in the black coat haunts her. The feeling of being stalked, of being hunted, she could never shake it. Sometimes, in the quiet of her own home, she still hears those footsteps, following her in the silence of the night. Mark had always loved the quiet solitude of camping in the wilderness. There was something about the seclusion, the peacefulness of being far from civilization, that soothed his soul. That's why he chose a remote camping spot deep within a forest for his solo trip. It was a place few ventured to, known only to those who appreciated nature's untouched beauty. Mark had planned for a few days of hiking, exploring, and disconnecting from the busy world he usually occupied. The air was crisp, the trees towering above him like ancient sentinels, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the birds overhead. On the second day of his stay, Mark set out for a hike deeper into the forest. The path was narrow and winding, leading him through dense brush and towering pines. As he walked, he admired the way sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The peaceful quiet of the forest was comforting, a world away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. However, that sense of tranquility was soon shattered. It started as a faint whisper, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. At first, Mark thought it was just the wind playing tricks on his ears. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. "Mark, help. Mark." His steps faltered. The voice sounded distant, like it was coming from far away. Mark stopped dead in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat. Who could be out here? There was no one else in sight, just the dense forest and the narrow trail. He looked around, scanning the trees for any signs of life. But the forest was still. No movement, no figures. The voice called again, now unmistakable, its tone desperate. "Mark, help me, please." Mark shook his head, trying to dismiss the strange feeling rising in his chest. It had to be the wind or some other natural phenomenon. Maybe it was just his imagination running wild. He pushed the thought aside and continued walking, telling himself he was being ridiculous. But the voice kept echoing in his mind. As he walked deeper into the forest, he heard the voice again. This time, it sounded louder, clearer, almost as if it were calling from right behind him. "Mark, please help me." It wasn't the wind. It wasn't his imagination. Someone or something was out there calling for help. Mark's curiosity got the better of him. Despite the unease bubbling in his gut, he turned and followed the sound, calling out into the empty forest, "Hello, who's there?" The voice didn't respond, but the faint cries continued, faint at first, but growing more desperate with each passing moment. It sounded like someone in serious distress. The more he followed the calls, the more unsettling it became. The forest around him grew darker, the trees seemed to close in, and the path grew more rugged, covered in roots and fallen branches. After what felt like an eternity, Mark arrived at a clearing. The voices had stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air, the only sound being the rustle of the wind through the leaves. Mark stood still for a moment, his breath quickening. He glanced around, expecting to see someone, anyone. But there was nothing. The clearing was empty. Not a soul in sight. He frowned, his nerves on edge. His instinct told him to leave, to turn around and go back to the safety of his campsite. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that there was something more to the voices, something he couldn't quite explain. Then, just as he was about to turn and retrace his steps, he heard something behind him, a loud rustling in the underbrush. He spun around, heart pounding in his chest, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. The figure was shrouded in shadow, standing motionless just beyond the trees. Mark's pulse raced, and he called out, "Hey, who's there?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, still and silent. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Was this a person? Or something else? His legs froze, a wave of cold fear washing over him. Without thinking, he took a step toward the figure. But the moment he moved, the figure vanished. In an instant, it was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. His heart hammered in his chest as he stood in stunned silence. What had just happened? The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if the forest itself were alive, watching him. Panic set in. He had to get back to camp. He had to get out of here. Mark turned around and hurriedly made his way back along the trail, his pace quickening with each step. His mind raced, replaying the encounter in his head. The figure, was it real? Or had it been some sort of trick of the light? He didn't know, but he couldn't shake the dread gnawing at his gut. As he neared the campsite, the voices returned. Faint at first, but growing louder and more urgent. Mark, help. Please. Mark. The voices were calling for him, echoing in the distance, closer than before. His blood ran cold. How was this possible? He had just been at the clearing, and there was no one there. No one had been calling for help. But now the voices were closer, and they were pleading, desperate. Mark, it's too late. Help me. Mark broke into a run. His breath came in sharp gasps as he raced back toward his tent, the voices ringing in his ears. The forest felt suffocating now, the trees looming over him like dark sentinels, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind a blur of panic and confusion. He couldn't outrun the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching him. When he reached the campsite, he skidded to a halt, eyes darting around. The voices stopped, leaving nothing but the eerie silence of the forest. Mark stood there, trembling, trying to calm his racing heart. He knew something had happened, but he couldn't explain it. He wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't. That night, Mark didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake the fear that clung to him. The forest felt alive, and he felt like an intruder in its vast, shadowed depths. He couldn't explain the voices, the figure, or the eerie sensation that had plagued him all day. It was as if he had stumbled into something ancient and forgotten, something that didn't want to be disturbed. The next morning, Mark packed up his gear and left the campsite, his nerves still raw from the previous night. As he hiked back to civilization, he tried to put the events behind him, but the feeling of being watched never left him. It stayed with him, gnawing at the back of his mind. Weeks later, Mark heard a story that chilled him to his core. Several hikers had gone missing in that area over the years, their bodies never found. No one knew what had happened to them, but there were rumors of strange occurrences, voices calling for help, figures lurking in the shadows, and hikers vanishing without a trace. Mark never returned to that forest. He couldn't. The memory of the voices, the figure, and the overwhelming sense of dread haunted him long after he left. He would never forget what he heard in those woods, voices that weren't meant to be followed.